Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alison Van Dyk. I'm the Executive Director of the Temple of Understanding, a 62-year-old interfaith organization. And I am so happy to have two women, two very good friends, old friends, people I've worked with for years, for this program, Women Interfaith Visionaries. And I want to start also by saying to all of you, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and then we'll have a couple of minutes at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions. Ask us anything. We're excited to be here all together. I also want to just welcome Reverend Canon Sally Bingham. Sally, I'm going to use first name. Sally has started the Regeneration Project, and she was the founder of Interfaith Power and Light. And I'm also happy to welcome Mary Evelyn Tucker. Mary Evelyn teaches at Yale University in the School of Environment and the Divinity School. And she and her husband, John Grimm, are the co-directors of the Forum on Religion and Ecology. So welcome both of you.
Thank you.
I want to start off by just asking each one of you, maybe start with you, Sally, how did you get involved in this work, interfaith and ecology? What drew you to start working in this area?
Well, it's an interesting story because I certainly didn't start out by saying climate's a religious issue and I need to get involved. It happened because I was invited in 1985 to be on the board of Environmental Defense Fund. And that's one of the largest, most effective environmental organizations in the country, and has grown even more so in the last 30 years. But they invited me to be on the board because I had a very wealthy husband, and I think that they thought he would give substantial amount of money to EDF. Well, I came on the board, and at every board meeting, they do presentations on environmental degradation, and I learned about overfishing and deforestation and lead in gasoline and polluted air. And then we were members of an Episcopal church here in San Francisco. And I would listen to the rector talk about loving each other, loving God, loving your neighbor as yourself. And it just began stirring in me, how can you love your neighbor and then pollute their air? How do you say you love God and then let creation be destroyed? So Alison, over maybe 3 years or so, I would say to the rector, why don't you ever talk about creation care from the pulpit? We have creation care in our baptismal vows, and he was not interested in talking about the environment from the pulpit. This is now 30 years ago, and it just wasn't done at that time. And priests and rectors and ministers were a little afraid to bring up what was considered a political subject. So he eventually said to me, why don't you go to seminary and find out where the disconnect is between what we say we believe in as Christians and how we behave? And I thought, well, that's a good idea. My youngest child was already full-time in school. The other two were one in high school, one in college. And so I went to Bishop Swing in San Francisco and asked him if he would sponsor me to go to seminary. And in the course of the conversation, he said, well, where did you go to college? And I had never gone to college. So I had to say, I didn't go to college. And he said, Sally, you think you can go and get a master's degree and you have yet to get an undergraduate degree? And that was the case. So I got in my car and drove over to the University of San Francisco, which is fairly close to me, and entered myself as a full-time freshman in college. I was 45 years old. So I did 4 years of college. All this time I was on the EDF board learning more and more about what humans were doing to the planet. And then after college, I went to seminary. And after seminary, I did 3 years in a church as a seminarian. So 10 years after this was sort of stirring in me, I was ordained to the priesthood. And then what was I going to do with that? Well, I had this really strong motive that people in the pews needed to understand that we are responsible for creation. And I sort of took it on myself to go around in the Episcopal Church and have every single congregation put in new light bulbs, solar on the roof, anything that would help to take care of creation and kind of live the mission that we were saying we were doing and hadn't up until now been doing. And I could talk this whole hour about getting started and the pros and cons and the failures and the successes, but that's how it began. It really started with me caring tremendously about the environment or creation care, and then taking it out into the world and having other people care about it too.
Wonderful. That's fascinating. Mary Evelyn, what about you? I know a little bit about where you started, but tell us more.
Well, I love hearing all that, Sally. It's just marvelous. What a journey. And mine began really, I would say, with family. My grandfather taught history at Columbia, and his name is Carlton Hayes, and he was one of the founders of the National Conference of Christian and Jews in 1926 and headed it up for 20 years. So that was one of the first interfaith organizations really in the country. And the parish that he was part of was led, Corpus Christi Parish in the Columbia area, was led by a very progressive priest, Father George Barry Ford, who himself was an astonishing interreligious figure, interracial figure, justice and peace. And together they were big supporters of Dorothy Day, my grandparents, and Father Ford. And Father Ford married my parents and baptized me. And he was in relationship with Union Seminary, a Catholic priest, and with Jewish Theological Seminary, and Riverside Church and the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. So this was way before even the Catholic Church had said there's truth in other religions, which they did in the Second Vatican Council in the early 60s. Imagine. So we've come a long, long way. And for some of these very courageous figures who, as I say, had a huge influence on me and my whole family, it was like, there's no prejudice here. Diversity is wonderful. And we welcome diversity of people and religions and so on. So that was hugely helpful in my education and family upbringing. And I went to college in Washington, D.C., and was very involved in the late 60s in the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And Nancy Pelosi went to the same college 10 years ahead of me. But we were very involved in what's the moral issue here. And when I saw religious leaders coming on board to say, separate but equal, that's not justice. And things began to change. And the same with the Vietnam War movement, an interreligious movement to say peace is what's needed. So that had a huge impact, and it still motivates me, as does social justice, to say that this moral force for the environment is a critical and missing component. Over the last 25 years, it's grown enormously, but that has been a huge motivation for me. And when I left college with great disillusionment from the uprisings of the Vietnam War and Kent State, students being killed, and the civil rights movement that was part of the Poor People's Campaign even then, but seeing Nixon elected and working on the McGovern campaign, it was a moment that we just knew something was deeply flawed in our system. And when I went to Japan, I taught at a college there in 73, 74, and that changed my life because I really was then dipped in the religions of Asia, especially Buddhism and Shinto in Japan. And as well as I began to travel during those years in other parts of Asia, I saw the profound impact of these religions that were very nature-based, interdependence of Buddhism and Shinto with the kami, the spirits in nature. And I'll talk more about Taoism and Confucian, but all of this was profoundly transformative. And of course, when I returned from Japan and began to study with Thomas Berry at Fordham University, starting in 75, and working closely with him for 40 years, that was the most profound inspiration of my whole life. So I'll end there, but I have great gratitude to family, ancestors, teachers, and Thomas Berry, and of course, working with my husband has been a source of immense joy and inspiration.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I did know some of that. Well, as you know, I basically came into the interfaith movement through Juliet Hollister. And I was 15 when she started the idea of the Temple of Understanding. She was a close friend of my mother's. And so she knew me when I was born. Basically, I'm about the same age as her children. And but I remember one day in particular going to her house for tea, and she started talking about this idea that she was just on fire about, bringing religious leaders together to learn to get together, learn to dialogue with each other, learn to understand each other, and to help with world problems. There were really two themes here. I got it. At 15, I think that's one of the reasons why I love working with young people. I think they're very open at that age. So I just followed her. I was on her board as a youth representative when I was 18. And Juliet was essentially training me to run the Temple of Understanding, although at the time I did not want that role. And I instead went off and became a child psychotherapist. I practiced child psychotherapy for 25 years. Before that, I was a farmer for 10 years in Vermont. I have a very varied background and stayed away from PhDs, but I am a mama. I have 2 MAs in child and family therapy. And through all the years, I kept in touch with Juliet. And then I moved back east after going out to California to school. And she had gone through a period of difficulty with the organization. She had overspent, those kinds of problems, had a big event that didn't go off as well as she'd hoped. And some people bailed her out. And I got back in touch with her when I came back east, and she said, it's gonna be okay. We're gonna go back and we're gonna put it together. And so I started working with her more closely at that point. And then when she passed away in 2000, I started to realize the people running the organization, they didn't really understand what she was about. They didn't get the interfaith element. I think people think about peace as being abstract, but for people in the interfaith movement, peace is an absolute necessity, and it's attainable, and it's something that we hold in our hearts, because if we don't have peace in this world, humanity is not going to make it. We're just not going to survive if we're going to just kill each other. So I decided that in spite of everything, I would jump in and take it over. So that's basically what I've been doing. I'm also interested because as women, I think we have certain challenges, and I like to call them opportunities, but I'm also interested in the kinds of challenges you all have had to deal with in terms of the interfaith work and running nonprofit organizations. So Sally, maybe you can start us off on what kind of challenges, what kind of opportunities do you feel really helped you formulate how you did your work, and sort of what your leadership style developed out of all that?
Well, in the very beginning, the whole business was a challenge. Talking about environmental issues from the pulpit and trying to get other clergy to do that was probably the biggest challenge in the beginning, because people thought it was a political issue. We have to separate church and state. We shouldn't be talking about these things in a congregation. And so that that's taken a long time to overcome. And it's not entirely overcome. I was in Idaho recently, preaching in a church in Sun Valley, and there were 1 or 2 people there who really didn't want to hear about climate change. And they spoke to the rector about it, and he had to apologize for me. So that is still happening, but far less so than it did in the beginning. And I have to say, so much of the success of Interfaith Power and Light has been organic, in the sense that we started in the Episcopal Church, but then the Jewish community wanted to get involved. I remember sitting at my desk and someone called and said, "Is that just for Episcopalians?" And we said, "Of course not. This is anybody who says they love God needs to also understand that they have to love creation, love each other, love their neighbors, not pollute." So it spread kind of on its own. I didn't phone Presbyterians and say, "Do you want to get involved?" They actually came to us and said, "This is our mission as well. We are moral people who care about the environment, and we want to be part of this movement." So it grew really on its own. And I just can't take credit for it, because it was something that all religions were ready to embrace. And so we became interfaith organically. And I know so little about interfaith work because of the way it came to me. And we had to learn, when can we have an event? And I found that there are certain days of the week when you just can't have a celebration. And we started having events on Thursday afternoon. We couldn't do it on Fridays. We couldn't do it on Saturday. We couldn't do it on Sunday, because either the Jews were doing something or the Christians were doing something. And so it ended up to be Thursday night. But when I started, I didn't know any of that. Those were all challenges, and in many cases, mistakes, until I got educated on interfaith work. And it's been totally fascinating. And I used to think that if I started working with the Jews, they'd want me to become Jewish. And it turns out none of that is true. Your own faith is strengthened by knowing these other faiths. And Mary Evelyn, of everyone I know, you know more about interfaith religions and who believes what than anyone I know. And I don't know whether you have learned that in school or whether you learned it through experience, but I've learned so much from you about interfaith work. And I'm still learning. This is not certainly not a done deal. Even though I've retired from Interfaith Power and Light, I'm still having invitations to do things like what we're doing today, and to go to congregations and preach about climate change. So it's much more accepted than it was 30 years ago. And then the interfaith part sort of happened on its own. We have congregations in all denominations that are part of Interfaith Power and Light across this country. And it's been a fascinating experience.
Mary Evelyn, how about you?
Well,
what challenges you looked at?
yeah,
Formative.
thank you. And I love Sally's wonderful and honest response there, because we are all learning. And I would just pick up the thread of, when I said Thomas Berry, I presume everybody knows who he is, but he was a cultural historian of world religions and ran the most astonishing history of religions program at Fordham University that people came from all over North America, actually. And I also studied with his very good friend, Ted DeBerry, at Columbia for my PhD in the world's religions. So I had an amazing, almost 10 years of graduate study, fortunately funded. But, that graduate study in all the world's religions is what prepared us to do the Harvard Conference Series in the mid-90s. So again, I'm so grateful for that knowledge and study and experience and practice. John Grimm's, my husband's field, is Native American traditions. He's been very involved with the Crow people in Montana, and we're adopted into a family there, and so on. But in terms of the opportunities and challenges, let me just say that, first of all, academia, in case you didn't know it, is extremely hard for women, extremely hard to this day for women. And I was the first person tenured at Bucknell in their religious studies program as a woman. When I came to when I came to Yale in 2006 with John, there were no tenured women in the School of the Environment, and women at Yale have struggled for a long, long time. So this is not easy. It is not easy. And the other huge challenge, I've been in secular academia my whole teaching career, 50 years, and religion is not understood, not at all. and of course, very much dismissed by scientists, and they just think it's part of the problem and so on. So that has been an immense challenge to explain the influence of religion around the world and its importance for the environment. 85% of the world's people claim some affiliation. And I would also say, though, divinity schools overall did not really get it from the beginning. I think Sally knows as well, and Alison too. You know, they were very involved in the Christian tradition, and some of them involved in social justice, but as Sally pointed out, it didn't get down to the pews on the environment and so on. And still today, we have those challenges. So it's getting better in the divinity schools, but in the 80s, we helped run programs at Claremont Seminary in California and the Chicago seminaries and Union Seminary with grants from Pew and MacArthur to get them up and running, working with Larry Rasmussen and some great, great people. But after that certain generation of Larry Rasmussen, Sally McFaig, Rosemary Ruther, and some others retired, they were not replaced in seminaries. So we have a long way to go. But here's the good news. The first program in religion and ecology was at Yale because of Gus Beth, who's an amazing environmental leader. And he said, after 40 years of environmental and policy work, we need religion, we need the arts, we need culture. And that's why he brought us to Yale to do this and set up the joint program. But since that time, 2006, and especially in the last few years, 16 graduate programs have emerged in religion and ecology, which we just discovered fairly recently how many. That's exciting. And that's because young people want this interdisciplinary area. They want to make a difference, knowing some of the science and ecology and whatnot. So that's very exciting and very positive. And I would say maybe finally, is part of the issue, the challenge has been in academia, schools of the environment or programs of the environment think everything's going to be solved by science and policy. Now economics is added, law and technology and so on, but it was very science driven. And the environmental movement has been very science driven, and that's great. It needs to be. We have so much to learn and listen from the scientists, but the communication of the urgencies of these issues did not come from science, unfortunately, except for people like Jim Hansen and some others. And they did that at great risk to their so-called objectivity. On the other hand, the divinity schools were all about humans and not about the environment. So this problem of environment, the planet, people, communities, Christian churches, and others was very dualistic, very separate silos. And finally, with the encyclical of the Pope Francis, Laudato Si, our care for our common home, these two are coming together. Cry of the earth, cry of the poor. And that's a phrase from Leonardo Boff, great theologian, liberation theologian from Brazil. And years ago, Thomas Berry said to Leonardo, we cannot save people, even help people without a healthy planet. So the well-being of people and planet have got to be seen as one continuity. And that's the brilliance, among many things, of that encyclical, which really takes on consumerism, capitalism, and so on, but brings forth this sense of beauty, awe, complexity of creation of our planet Earth and universe. So those are some of the challenges and opportunities, and I feel we're really moving forward now with that based on work of Alison and Judith Hollister and Sally and so many others. So I feel very positive.
That's fascinating.
Alison, may I add, Alison,
Sure.
can I, Mary Evelyn just reminded me of something,
Sure.
and you perhaps were even there when Al Gore, Tim Wirth, and Carl Sagan were all together in one of those big rooms in Washington, D.C. Early on, it was early 90s. And the scientific community was inviting the religious community to get involved. I mean, Carl Sagan, said that scientists are difficult or have a hard time communicating, and that they needed the moral voices of religious leaders to start preaching and talking about environmental degradation. And I remember clearly sitting there with these really well-known scientists and lots of religious leaders. Jim Morton was there Emmy.
Yeah.
Were you at that meeting? It happened in the early to mid 90s. And then we
Right.
all went on to Rio de Janeiro for what would have been the first UN environmental conference. And it all kind of, it just didn't happen at that time, even though the invitation was there from the scientists saying, we need you, religious leaders. It still was very, very slow to take hold. But as you say, the good news is it is happening now. I think every religion, at least in this country, every religion has embraced the responsibility for caring for creation. And some do it better than others, but I think it is happening.
Definitely. And not just in this country, but around the world. You know, that's the beauty. Religion and ecology movement is a worldwide movement. And on the Forum website, there's statements, as you know, from all the world's religions, including statements that support Laudato Si, but statements from their own tradition and engaged projects.
Right.
I can speak more about. But you're absolutely right. Ed Wilson was hugely helpful to us at Harvard and said, you've got to bring the religious community on board. And my feeling is the scientists, I don't want any of us to take religion as an instrumental kind of effort. We have to really understand the power of religious belief systems, liturgies, faith, etc. And that's part of our communication effort without being rhetorical and preachy and evangelizing, for example. So anyway, back to you, Alison, but thanks so much.
Well, I have to go back to the Temple of Understanding's 1975 conference, which was at the United Nations.
Yep.
And it was, in a lot of ways, it was a very thing for the organization to take that on. It was kind of a first because religion was not looked on in a positive way with the secular United Nations attitude towards everything. But after that event, religion became practically a no, we will never, ever discuss religion again at the United Nations. We don't. He threw us out on our ear. It was just shocking. And I'm still not sure why. But, you know, I think that when you go back to something like 1975, you can understand the power of this negative attitude towards religion, that it's mind-boggling and it was really difficult to overcome. Yeah, and then, you know,
sorry, just very quickly, sorry. I was, you know, part of that, and Ewart Cousins and Thomas Berry and so on. We're all part of that, and especially the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, deeply, deeply involved. And I think it's so interesting that you're pointing out this resistance from secular institutions. But I do want to say right now, finally, United Nations Environment Program has picked up Faith for Earth in the last couple of years. And so it's taken all this time, right? 50 years, but we are moving forward. But back to you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Absolutely. I mean, I was going to go on to talk about the conference, the big conference we had in 1988, where we brought together parliamentarians, scientists, a lot of religious leaders, Carl Sagan, you know, many people like that. And the idea was trying to look at human survival. How are we going to survive? So, I mean, I think there's been this fascinating evolution where today we have the UN Committee on Religious NGOs. We have, I'm also working on an Indigenous committee where we're exploring all of the issues of Indigenous cultures and the problems that they're up against. And it's primarily religion that we're talking about. So, I mean, I think there has been an amazing shift at the United Nations. And I always think to myself that when people get upset about the fact that we're not moving faster, as you pointed out, that it's not happening more quickly, I keep thinking to myself that if you have that long view, I mean, if you've been, you know, trudging through the halls of the United Nations for all these years and hoping that things will open up, and then you see the changes that are taking place now, especially with the UN Environment Program, for instance. It's our UN representative is very involved in all of that and gives a lot of input on it. I think that we are beginning to come into our own. my personal challenge in a lot of ways was more around looking at this prestigious organization and saying to myself, wow, how am I going to run this? I mean, I just was like, I was looking at these amazing figures that had before me. And I wrote a letter to someone that I had a lot of high respect for and said, Father Thomas Keating, please help me. What do you think? What should I do? I mean, I'm like taking this on and I don't feel like I'm, qualified really in a lot of ways. But actually being a child psychotherapist has been very useful for me. And I think that a lot of where I just sort of got into my stride was around the idea of turning a lot of our programs into youth programs. So we had the Season for Nonviolence. It started out as being, a very high level event with the Kings and all sorts of people there. And the next time around, I turned it into a youth program and had that going for, I don't know, like about, I think it was 2002 to about 2010, and bringing students from all over New York City to the United Nations to learn about peace and learn about Gandhi, King, and it was wonderful. And then we gave them all literature that the teachers could use for the year. So I think that in a way, my challenges were just sort of taught me to just go with my instinct, just go with my sort of sense of who do I want to give a Hollister Award to? Who do we think would be a good, person to lift up? And we had Father Thomas Berry, as you know, and Wangari Maathai, and people before they were well known. We were able to bring these people in, and so I think that the challenges strengthened me a lot and helped me grow and helped me also have a lot of confidence in my intuition or whatever. So I think that was, that's kind of where my leadership style is. I'm very much in the background, and I'm very proud of all the programs that we've been running all these years. So it's, that kind of area of, where you fit best, and, you just go for that. I'm wondering if each of you could just give us an idea of what you think was your most significant contribution to the area of interfaith education and education around the issues of ecology. I think maybe hone in on what you feel was the most significant, Sally, that you brought to the table.
Well, that's a hard one, but I want to say, when you were talking, Alison, about instinct, I think a lot of us as women have very good instincts, and sometimes they get overshadowed by people who think they know better. And I think trusting one's as an intelligent woman is something we all need to pay attention to. In terms of a significant influence, it's hard for me to pinpoint that, because so much of the work I've been doing was really pushed ahead by other people. I just happened to be kind of an agent. And certainly with interfaith work, it was because, I started hanging out with the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew. And I learned so much from, and Emmy was on those trips with us when we went out to the Baltic Sea and were with religious leaders, journalists, and scientists. And I would come back with information I had obtained from the people I was with. And that was sort of true all along. I never felt that I had the answers or that I already knew everything I needed to run an interfaith organization. It was continued and being open to new ideas. And I would say that for anybody who's starting out on something in a new venture, we know so much less than we think we know. And it's a constant, well, I could say that another way. We actually know than we realize we know. And we need to trust those instincts and believe in it because and it has been because God's on my side. And that might sound silly to somebody, but I never would have done this without the support of a very powerful soul, if you will, or mystery working in my life saying, do this, do this, do this. And even when it was difficult and I was called, the little old lady from San Francisco who wants to take us back in time and get us back into horse and buggy and, use candles and take cold showers. And I was that and no, but something inside of me kept saying, this is right. You don't give up and keep on. And so I kept being on. And now, this IPL, Interfaith Power and Light work, is in 40 states around the country with some 27,000 congregations involved. And I feel that most people who sit in a pew understand that we have a responsibility to protect creation. And I take credit for that. I mean, not all the credit, obviously, but that was the message we started out with. Every single person who said they love God and love their neighbor absolutely must stand under and responsible mission statement when started 25 years ago. And I feel that there's been tremendous progress there. And other people have realized how important it is. And other people are taking that message and going all over the world with it. Emmy knows that. I mean, you're really one of the founders of this whole movement. And, I just kind of came along for the ride, getting pushed by oral message.
So Mary Evelyn, you're on.
Okay, well, I love that, Sally. And I do recall the wonderful, extraordinary pilgrimages, symposiums we were on together on many occasions with His Holiness Bartholomew, the Orthodox head of the Greek Church. And he was one, even before Pope Francis, who said there are crimes against creation, there's ecological sin. I remember in 1997 being in LA at St. Barbara's Church and him making that statement. So this sense that creation is holy, is sacred, is what is true to all of the world's religions. And that is something that education needs to embrace. And as I said, I feel we have really created such a secular education in this country, including high schools and colleges and universities, that we have science as a leading way of knowing and religion as a very secondary way of knowing, and spirituality, and we don't have words that communicate in these secular environments. So I think the educational world needs to come on board and is coming on board, even though, as we all know, it's taken a great deal of time. So I think, beginning in terms of the educational contributions or whatever, from many, many people, this has been a very, very joint project with scholars and environmentalists for 25 years. But it did begin at Harvard with the conferences that we had for 3 years on all the world's religions and what would be their views of nature, their environmental contributions, and their work on the ground. And that was a great discovery, a great research project. And so that was from 95 to 98. And then for another 7 years, we brought the books out from each of these conference series. And, they're quite comprehensive in many ways. I mean, at the Christianity and Ecology Conference in 97, we had 200 people from many different areas. And the opening of these traditions to say, yes, this is part of our responsibility. We had to create an academic field that would be supportive of and integrated with the force that people like Sally have led, that there's an engaged moral dimension to this. But with the sense that religions are changing, theologians have got to do eco-theology, we need a new environmental ethics. All of that was blank. What does it mean to talk about dominion and now stewardship or care for creation? That has got to be worked out through seminaries and academic institutions to support the changes. So that was our hope, a field and a force. And after the Harvard conferences, we had 3 conferences in New York at the UN, where we announced the Forum on Religion and Ecology in 1998, at the Natural History Museum with 1,000 people from all over. They gave us the IMAX theater rent-free, and we had people from the science community, education community, policy community there, including Tim Wirth and others, Dewey Ming, the great Confucian scholar, and Bill Moyers interviewed all of these people from the various world religions up on the stage, and no one was paid anything. It was this sense, this is important, this is crucial. So there's been these amazing openings. And in founding the Forum on Religion and Ecology, then we wanted to create this website, which we hope will be useful for people. It has 1,000 pages on it now, and it's been curated by our one full-time staff member, Tara Trapani, has done an extraordinary job, and we send out this newsletter and so on. But my point is, when Gus Speth brought us to Yale for this joint program, that was the key educational piece that opened up, surprising to us, to say, yes, this has got to be integrated with science and policy and law and so on. And so just to conclude, the journey, like Sally just said, at every stage of this journey, openings have happened that were unexpected. You know, Gus Speth founded NRDC. He founded World Resources Institute. He was head of UN Development Program, and he came out of Yale Law School, you know, just profoundly convinced that we can do this through the law, and then realizing we can't, and we need new educational vehicles to do this. So that was an opening totally unexpected. And I guess I would just say our final offering at this stage of this journey are these courses from Coursera on the world's religions and ecology, which are an introduction to religion and ecology, the Western religions, South Asian religions, Hinduism, Jainism, East Asian religions, Confucianism and Taoism, indigenous religions, and one on Christianity alone. And we hope that that will bring this field and force out to a larger public in many parts of the world. So anyway, thanks for the question, and look forward to seeing this final question.
Yes, thank you. I thought a little bit about what major things I'm proud of. And I think the first one is the educational element that I brought to the Temple of Understanding, that we had these big summits, and then we started having smaller gatherings with different universities. And so when I took over, all of those things were sort of in the past. And so I started with the Hollister Awards, having, you know, really significant people and doing significant events, and everything was more or less around ecology. So we had a lot of people that were in the field that were aware of the need to try to marry and the science and address the ecological issues of our time. And that became more and more of a focus for us. And I'm very happy that we were able to do that, because to me today, it's just the most important thing, is to bring about, you know, the education. So the other thing was, you know, as I said, moving towards programs, which we had a whole variety that we put on that brought young people to site visits. They would study a book if somebody wrote it, and then we'd go around to these different sites and then talk about what they experienced. And we also had a program that Sister Jones started, where young people went to the United Nations specifically in the summer and had an experience of learning about the UN, and then developing their own thesis about, you know, what was the most important thing to them, and how did they kind of look at that that 1 month, and amazingly, everyone that's gone through that program, every young person says it was a life changer for them. So I think those are, just really important things to highlight about the educational part of our work, because we were really started as an educational organization. And then the other thing that I feel like I'm some sort of a like an archivist or something like that, because one of the things I did was I've made 5 films about starting way back in 1960, taking Juliet to India and having her meet with Mother Teresa and some of the people that she was when they had their first big conference in 1968. So all of those films, including our work at the UN, and then more recent ones about what has the Temple of Understanding been doing, I think those are really important. And because I want the next generation to be able to have access, as Mary Evelyn just said, to this material, because it's very important to understand how effective religions have been and are becoming in terms of the crises that we are facing today, that humanity is facing. And without that sense of the higher power that Sally, you talked about, I feel like, people need hope. Young people need that hope. It's a really challenging time for them. So I think also I'm excited about the fact that we're almost finished with an actual written history of the Temple of Understanding. It's taken me many years to slog through all of these newsletters and all of these different programs. But the idea is that for people who want to know how to do interfaith education, I think that we're really putting a blueprint together. And I think that's really the main legacy that I'm proud of. So I want to have each one of you have a little bit of time before we get into the questions, just to kind of talk about where you found support yourself, and what would you say to the next generation of young leaders? So just give them it doesn't have to be too long, but Sally, go ahead.
Well, just before I go into that, in listening to both of you talking and picking up on the education that's so important to the Temple of Understanding and to the Forum on Religion and Ecology. And you've both had amazing educations, and you're carrying that education out to the world with your message. Mine was a little different. Mine has been much more emotional. I don't have the academic background that you two have. And I certainly am not anywhere near as smart. So I have used emotional, moral, and emotional feelings to reach people. So, because my message comes from the pulpit, it doesn't come from being a teacher in a school, and it comes from literally, mostly it's emotion. It's reaching people's hearts versus their minds. And when I finish a sermon at a congregation and I'm standing at the back and shaking people's hands, and someone will say to me, I just never thought about it like that before. But it's an emotion that comes up versus academic study. So you all have had this tremendous success in academia and bringing your organizations alive with smart brains. Mine has been much more emotional and much more organic. So if I were going to say to somebody younger who wants to work interfaith or work maybe just on climate, I would say very important to stay connected to the scientific world. I think bringing the two institutions of religion and science together is really important. If you ask clergy to give a sermon on climate change and you don't give them the information that comes from science, they can't even back up what they say when they get to coffee hour and someone says, it's not 350 parts per million, it's another number. And I think it's hard for us, or it was hard in Interfaith Power and Light to give sample sermons to clergy who were comfortable giving that message. So again, I'm also almost backtracking a bit, but again, it does go back to education in the sense that if you're going to talk about climate, then you've got to have some facts, and that comes from science. So I would say, stay connected to the scientific community. And I'm still serving on the board of the Union of Concerned Scientists has something they call the National Advisory Board. And I work with them. We have meetings 3 times a year. So if I need a scientist to give me some information on something, I have friends in the scientific community that I can call on. And I would keep the science close in starting out on this work. Now, does that help with interfaith? Probably not so much as just understanding that we're all in this together. All the faiths have some kind of a moral message within their religions that calls for creation care, and hold that up because it's there. Mary Ellen, you can tell us better than anybody about all these different religions that have creation care at their foundation. And it just needs to be highlighted. And we need to show that we're all working together. I mean, we don't have to do this in separate categories of our different religions. We can all work together, fighting for the same thing, which is preservation of creation and ultimately preservation of humanity.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I just, I'm in a period where dualisms are no longer useful. And so rationalism versus emotion and so on. I am profoundly emotionally driven. I am profoundly intuitively aware. And I think that is part of the women's role. But I think here's the issue, is in a classroom, you can't be an advocate. You have to give facts suggesting values. And that's the new integration, the facts from science and ecology with values. What does this mean? How does it matter in our lives? And that's what we have done for 50 years. And our students feel the emotional impact of what we are engaged in, I can assure you. And every talk I give outside of academia is charged with emotion and urgency and passion and hopefully compassion. So I just don't want us to divide this up too much, because everyone I know in the academic world involved in religion and ecology is very similarly engaged. They are worried sick about the future. And therefore, we've got to integrate all of our skills, our knowledge, our action, our rational, our emotional, our intuitive. So but that has been a challenge, I have to say, because most of my talks are outside of academia. I wouldn't be giving at a place like Yale, but I welcome the opportunity to be in touch with so many others. But the classroom is a place where we can generate deep concern as well as the factual knowledge from science. And I'm grateful to my science friends at Yale and elsewhere for the same reasons. Just quickly for support, obviously, I've said already, my greatest support has come from John Grimm, a specialist in indigenous traditions. But everything we do, fortunately, every conference we've done, the books we've written, our daily meals are surrounded with these issues. And it's just a joy to create with such a partner. And Thomas Berry was the third partner in this. We would meet him often and edit his books together and have meals, and John and Thomas enjoyed a margarita and so on. So this has been a journey with extraordinary people, and I'd like to just say, in terms of one other support person, of course, has been Brian Swim, and I want to just bring in the Journey of the Universe project here, because I think as well as the different world's religions, we're at a moment of beyond religions in a certain way, or meta religions, or the spiritual, not religious. And Journey of the Universe, which is a film, a book, a series of conversations, and online courses, also with Coursera. But that was done with the great inspiration of Teilhard de Chardin, Jesuit priest and scientist, and Thomas Berry's notion that we need a new story. And that has been translated, the book, into many languages, the film into many languages. We've shown it in China numerous times, the last time for 77,000 people watching it streaming. And the appeal here, you see, is something that, as Sally ended her wonderful comments just now, how do we bring everyone together with a sense that this is a sacred universe, that this is a spiritually infused Earth community, and that we're part of something larger that's evolved over 13.8 years. So that is an inspiration, I think, that has spiritual depth, scientific and ecological solidity, but also something that says we need the inspiration for the perspiration, for the action to be done going forward. And our students have responded to this enormously. So that's my suggestion. Let's keep the religious movement field and force going forward. And let's also keep this spiritual, ecological, evolutionary view open and attuned. 9,000 people joined a seminar that I moderated here at Yale, talking about the communication of trees and forests with Robin Kimmerer, David Haskell, and Rob McFarlane, the great nature writer in England. Why? Because that is what's pulling people to say, we live in a sentient, living Earth community, and we've got to engage that as well in our work.
Yes, I was one of those 9,000 people. That was a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Absolutely incredible. And we've been working along the same line, of course. But I want to just quickly end with my perspective here. I want to talk about a young man named Clayton Harvey. Clayton he's a Apache young man. He left the reservation because he was very discouraged. He got in trouble. He didn't explain everything about it, but finally decided that he needed to go back home. He started farming. He started teaching young people about farming. And I think, to me, those examples, and these are part of these dialogues that we have, the farm dialogues that we have annually and our monthly dialogue, these are examples for young people that lift up the incredible power that they actually have to do something. And I think, to me, that's what I'm excited about. I'm just so excited about the work that they're doing, about these incredible young farmers that are just taking up this cause and bringing the spiritual into the earth and into the soil. So this has been an incredible discussion. I don't know if anyone has a question or not, because we have to finish at 2, and I don't see a question. So
I just want to give a quick shout out to Sister Joan Kirby, who has passed on, and her great work, in addition to Judith, and also Grove Harris, who's been such a friend and supporter for many, many years. And you all at the Temple, and Grove in particular, helped to organize the showing of Journey at the United Nations. And we're just so grateful to have worked with you over so many years. So big thank you, and thanks to Susie for supporting this today, and Alison for hosting us.
Well, yeah, let me add. I want to add my thanks as well. And I don't think I talked about the support that I've had. I got into something else last time and neglected to mention that I've had wonderful support from the Bishop of California, who made me canon for the environment. And that's been a huge support. And also the foundations that have funded our work. We couldn't have done any of it without them. So I would have to give a shout out to the foundations that are on our website or an annual report, who have allowed this work to happen by supporting us, because that's been hugely beneficial, because without them, we wouldn't have been able to do this work. And thank you, Alison, too, for doing this little event today. This was quite fun.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. It's been fascinating, just fascinating. And I think there's lots of wonderful food for thought here that hopefully our audience will be able to digest and continue the good work. Thank you all.